more.
Okay. The book that I chose, can you hear me? No. Horton Hatches the Egg. And it was published in 1940 by Dr. Seuss, who was the pen name of Theodore Seuss Geisel. He was an American children's author and illustrator who I found out through research after I picked this book, just purely because it meant something to me, that he also worked as a cartoonist and an illustrator for advertising campaigns. And he worked on the campaign for Quick Henry, the Flit, the bug spray. He worked for oil companies doing their advertising. So totally opposite children's books. But he published over 60 books during his lifetime, and he wrote The Cat in the Hat, and later One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish, and Green Eggs and Ham, which if you have children, you probably are familiar with those books. And he wrote those in response to a request from an executive at Horton Mifflin to write an exciting book for early readers that had only 236 words in it, so that children would have an exciting book to read that they could actually read, that wasn't filled with vocabulary words that were above them. So why did I choose Horton Hatches the Egg? Well, it's been a favorite in our family for 3 generations. It was read to me as a child. In fact, the book that I'll be reading from today is the 1958 edition. And in my mother's dear handwriting, it's inscribed to me with the date 1958. And a date in October, which I don't know why I would have received something special in October, but it's in her handwriting. So that's very, very special to me. Now, I also read the book to our 3 children when they were young from a more recent edition, which just happens to be the one that someone brought here with the green cover. Now I find that I read it to my grandchildren. My husband and I have five grandchildren, and I read it to them among other books. Now, Dr. Seuss once said that kids can see a moral coming a mile off. So I think his goal was not to write something with the moral in mind, but he made his stories this particular story so action-packed, and Horton, who's the elephant hero, so endearing that I think the moral just slips in. And when I thought about the book, I like the rhythm of the lines, and the drama and the storyline, which unfortunately I can't manage to show you the illustrations at the same time, but they're really, really nice. They're based on real animals, so that you can identify tigers and giraffes. Yes, I really like the moral of the story. So I'll go ahead and read the story. Yep. Sure, if someone will volunteer to hold it so that.
There was a reason we had a second copy. Okay, now maybe even the Zoomers can see this.
Yes.
Okay, Horton Hatches the Egg.
Okay. Sighed Maisie, a lazy bird hatching an egg. I'm tired and I'm bored and I've kinks in my legs from just sitting here day after day. It's work. How I hate it. I'd much rather play. I'd take a vacation, fly off for a rest, if I could find someone to stay on my nest. If I could find someone, I'd fly away free. Then Horton the elephant passed by her tree. Hello, called the lazy bird, smiling her best. You've nothing to do, and I do need a rest. Would you like to sit on the egg in my nest? The elephant laughed. Why, of all silly things, I haven't feathers and I haven't wings. Me on your egg? Why, that doesn't make sense. Your egg is so small, ma'am, and I'm so immense. Tut, tut, answered Maisie. I know you're not small, but I'm sure you can do it, no trouble at all. Just sit on it softly. You're gentle and kind. Come, be a good fellow. I know you won't mind. I can't, said the elephant. Please, begged the bird. I won't be gone long, sir. I give you my word. I'll hurry right back. Why, I'll never be missed. Very well, said the elephant, since you insist. You want a vacation, go fly off and take it. I'll sit on your egg and I'll try not to break it. I'll stay and be faithful. I mean what I say. Toodaloo, sang out Maisie and fluttered away. The first thing to do, murmured Horton. Let's see. The first thing to do is to prop up this tree and make it much stronger. That has to be done. Before I get on it, I must weigh a ton. Then carefully, tenderly, gently he crept up the trunk to the nest where the little egg slept. Then Horton the elephant smiled. Now that's that. And he sat, and he sat, and he sat, and he sat. And he sat all that day, and he kept the egg warm. And he sat all that night through a terrible storm. It poured, and it lightened, it thundered, it rumbled. This isn't much fun, the poor elephant grumbled. I wish she'd come back, 'cause I'm cold and I'm wet. I hope that Maisie bird doesn't forget. But Maisie, by this time, was far beyond reach, enjoying the sunshine way off in Palm Beach, and having such fun, such a wonderful rest, decided she'd never go back to her nest. So Horton kept sitting there day after day, and soon it was autumn, the leaves blew away. And then came the winter, the snow and the sleet, and icicles hung from his trunk and his feet. But Horton kept sitting and said with a sneeze, I'll stay on this egg and I won't let it freeze. I meant what I said and I said what I meant, an elephant's faithful 100%. So poor Horton sat there the whole winter through, and then came the springtime with troubles anew. His friends gathered around and they shouted with glee, Look, Horton the elephant's up in a tree. They taunted, they teased him, they yelled, How absurd. Old Horton the elephant thinks he's a bird. They laughed and they laughed, then they all ran away. And Horton was lonely, he wanted to play. But he sat on the egg and continued to say, I meant what I said and I said what I meant. An elephant's faithful 100%. No matter what happens, this egg must be tended. But poor Horton's troubles were far, far from ended. For while Horton sat there so faithful, so kind, 3 hunters came sneaking up softly behind. He heard the men's footsteps, he turned with a start. 3 rifles were aiming right straight at his heart. Did he run? He did not. Horton stayed on that nest. He held his head high and he threw out his chest. And he looked at the hunters as much as to say, Shoot if you must, but I won't run away. I meant what I said and I said what I meant. An elephant's faithful 100%. But the men didn't shoot, much to Horton's surprise. They dropped their 3 guns and they stared with wide eyes. Look, they all shouted, can such a thing be? An elephant sitting on top of a tree. It's strange, it's amazing, it's wonderful new. Don't shoot him, we'll catch him. That's just what we'll do. Let's take him alive, why he's terribly funny. We'll sell him back home to a circus for money. And the first thing he knew, they had built a big wagon with ropes on the front for the pullers to drag on. They dug up his tree and they put it inside, with Horton so sad that he practically cried. We're off, the men shouted, and off they all went, with Horton unhappy 100%. Up out of the jungle, up into the sky, up over the mountains 10,000 feet high, then down the mountains and down to the sea went the cart with the elephant, egg, nest, and tree. Then out of the wagon and onto a ship, out over the ocean, and oh, what a trip, rolling and tossing and splashed with the spray. And Horton said, day after day after day, I meant what I said, and I said what I meant, but ooh, am I seasick 100%. After bobbing around for 2 weeks like a cork, they landed at last in the town of New York. All ashore the men shouted, and down with a lurch went Horton the elephant, still on his perch. Tied onto a board that could just scarcely hold him, bump, Horton landed, and then the men sold him. Sold to a circus, then week after week, they showed him to people at 10 cents a peek. They took him to Boston, to Kalamazoo, Chicago, Weehawken, and Washington too, to Dayton, Ohio, St. Paul, Minnesota, to Wichita, Kansas, to Drake, North Dakota, and everywhere thousands of folks flocked to see and laugh at the elephant up in a tree. Poor Horton grew sadder the farther he went, but he said as he sat in the hot, noisy tent, I meant what I said and I said what I meant, an elephant's faithful 100%. Then one day, the circus show happened to reach a town way down south, not so far from Palm Beach, and dawdling along way up high in the sky, who, of all people, should chance to fly by, but that old good-for-nothing bird, Runaway Maisie, still on vacation and still just as lazy. And spying the flags and the tents just below, she sang out, what fun, well, I'll go to the show. and she swooped from the clouds through an open tent door. "Good gracious," gasped Maisie, "I've seen you before." Poor Horton looked up with his face white as chalk. He started to speak, but before he could talk, there rang out the noisiest, ear-splitting squeaks from the egg that he'd sat on for 51 weeks. A thumping, a bumping, a wild-alive scratching. "My egg," shouted Horton, "my egg, why, it's hatching." "But it's mine," screamed the bird when she heard the egg crack. The work was all done. Now she wanted it back. "It's my egg," she sputtered. "You stole it from me. Get off my nest and get out of my tree." Poor Horton backed down with a sad, heavy heart. But at that very instant, the egg burst apart, and out of the pieces of red and white shell, from the egg that he'd sat on so long and so well, Horton the elephant saw something whiz. It had ears and a tail and a trunk just like his. And the people came shouting, "What's all this about?" They looked and they stared with their eyes popping out. Then they cheered and they cheered and they cheered more and more. They'd never seen anything like it before. "My goodness, my gracious," they shouted, "my word, it's something brand new. It's an elephant bird. And it should be like that." Because Horton was faithful. He sat and he sat. He meant what he said and he said what he meant. And they sent him home happy, 100%. The end. So I chose this because of my fond memories of reading it to my children and my grandchildren and to myself by my mother. But once I decided to share this story, I discovered that many other people had been interested in it to the extent that it has actually been used for academic articles on the topics of economics, Christianity, feminism, and adoption. So since this is a church service, I wanted to say, apparently, like Horton, early Christians faced persecution and ridicule for their actions. And in 2004, a retired United Methodist pastor published an article in which he compared Horton to the early Christians to whom the first epistle of Peter was addressed. Because like those early Christians, Horton faces persecution and ridicule for his actions, but he is faithful to his mission and he's rewarded for his faithfulness, as evidenced by that really cute elephant bird that hatches at the end of the story. So what does Horton mean by faithful? Well, he promises to keep his word, his promise to tend his egg and be faithful to that no good for nothing bird Maisie. It doesn't matter that she's flown off, but he feels so compelled to keep his word that he goes through all these horrible travails, including a hot, noisy circus tent and the seasickness on the ship, the hunters hunting him, and pure humiliation. His friends even turn on him in the jungle. So that to me, that's the moral of the story, that being faithful is a really good thing. And Horton is faithful to himself. But what is faith? I started thinking about this because I have just internalized it. You know, I think being faithful, if you say you're going to do something, that's really important. And if you can't follow through with what you've promised, well, then you talk to the person, or you say something, you communicate. You don't just flake off, because personally, that's what bothers me, if people say they're going to do something and they don't carry through with it. We all understand that things happen and people can't carry through with it, but to just not show up or not carry through is the worst thing. So I got to thinking about faith. So in the United States, we have, I found, thinking about this, we have faith in the U.S. government. Well, many of us do, not everyone. For example, the U.S. Treasury issues bonds and investments that are, quote, and this is from the U.S. Treasury website, that those treasuries are backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. So we have faith in the government. We also have a lot of expressions like, keep the faith, baby, you know. Blind faith. Have you ever said, you're going to have to take this on blind faith? Or a leap of faith. You know, you can't prove it. You're going to have to take a leap. So it's something, confidence or a trust in someone, a thing or concept without hard evidence. And So how do you demonstrate faith? Well, to me, Horton demonstrates faith by his actions. And showing faith in the religious sense, to me, is done by action too, by living according to your beliefs, as we heard in the reading, internalizing the Spirit and living by those tenets of whatever faith you follow, which are usually being good, as opposed to those fleshly temptations from the reading today. So being faithful to others is important to building trust, because if you're not faithful to your word, how can someone trust you? So we look at other people and say, can we trust this person? Do they have faith? Do they follow through with what their beliefs are, what their thinking is? And so trust, to me, is closely aligned with being faithful, and which allows us to rely on others for help, for support. And so Mother Teresa said, be faithful in small things, because it is in them that your strength lies. So faith has many meanings to me, from your very small things of your everyday life to your spiritual inner being and what you believe in. So, thank you.